Have you ever wondered why those who see too much, those who notice the truths others overlook, often end up broken rather than empowered? Carl Jung, one of the founding fathers of modern psychology, called this discovery his most dangerous. The paradox is clear: to perceive the reality with extraordinary depth is to risk isolation, exhaustion, and even psychological collapse. Yet at the same time, it is this rare perception that can transform a person into something extraordinary. What Jung uncovered more than a century ago continues to unsettle psychologists today. And the real question is, if you happen to carry this ability, will it destroy you or redefine you? Jung's insight did not emerge from abstract theorizing. It was born from clinical practice. Around 1913, during his own turbulent break with Freud, Jung encountered a patient who became the cornerstone of his revelation. This woman, introverted and profoundly intuitive, displayed a faculty that Jung had not seen so vividly before. She could enter a room and immediately detect hidden tensions. She knew who was lying, who was masking despair behind a smile, and who silently carried resentments. Her ability to read the unconscious atmosphere was not guesswork. Jung carefully verified her observations, and they proved remarkably accurate. Yet what might sound like a superpower quickly revealed itself as a curse. She could not maintain ordinary friendships because people felt uncomfortably exposed in her presence. She could not hold trivial conversations because she saw through every social facade. Even keeping a job became nearly impossible, as her very presence unsettled the unspoken agreements that allow groups to function smoothly. Jung realized that she was not suffering from psychosis or delusion. Instead, she represented the extreme case of what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception grows so finely tuned that it becomes socially dangerous. This recognition led Jung to investigate a phenomenon he later called participation mystique. Some individuals, he wrote, absorb not only what people consciously communicate, but the entire unconscious climate of their environment. They are like psychic antennae picking up everything that others deny, repress, or refuse to acknowledge. Modern research, such as the work of Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons, has provided empirical support for this observation. About 20% of the population shows heightened emotional and sensory sensitivity. But Jung pointed to something even rarer: the introverted intuitive type, perhaps only 1% of humanity, who not only feels deeply, but discerns unconscious patterns with uncanny clarity. What makes this perception dangerous, Jung argued, is not the vision itself, but the psychic isolation it produces. To see what others cannot or will not see is to become a mirror in which society refuses to gaze. And mirrors, as history shows, are often smashed. Those with differentiated intuition become scapegoats, accused of creating problems they merely reveal. They are attacked not for their flaws, but for reflecting the shadow that others cannot bear to face. Jung's clinical notes reveal how disturbingly consistent this pattern was. The more accurate the perception, the more others resisted it. When his intuitive patients gently suggested that someone seemed worried, the reaction was often explosive. You're being negative or you're inventing problems. When they voiced concern about obvious issues, they were accused of exaggeration, creating drama, or being judgmental. Jung recognized this not as coincidence, but as a defense mechanism. People defend themselves against unwanted truths by attacking the person who perceives them. In Jung's words, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Yet for most, it was easier to project hostility onto the perceptive individual than to confront their own shadow. This dynamic created what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals became the designated problem in any group they entered, not because they introduced conflict, but because their very presence illuminated conflicts already hidden within the collective unconscious. Jung observed the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository of all that the group cannot consciously recognize in itself. This explains why those with such gifts often report not just misunderstanding, but systematic exclusion, blame, and even hostility. Jung pushed further, categorizing 4 distinct variations within the introverted intuitive type. The first was the feeling intuitive individuals who absorbed emotions so completely they could not distinguish their own feelings from those of others. They lived in what Jung described as a state of perpetual emotional contagion. The second was the thinking intuitive people who recognized unconscious patterns and could predict outcomes months before they occurred. Without any deliberate analysis, they saw the logical conclusions of processes invisible to others. The third type, the sensation intuitive, physically registered the unconscious states of others. They could feel fatigue, illness, or tension in their own bodies before the individual experiencing it became aware. Finally, there was the rare, pure intuitive, a person who perceived everything yet struggled to organize or express these perceptions coherently. Overwhelmed, they lived in near constant psychic burden. Each type, Jung insisted, faced its own unique dangers. For some, the peril was losing touch with their own emotions, drowned in the feelings of others. For others, the risk was intellectual inflation, believing themselves prophets who could see inevitable outcomes. For still others, the hazard was psychosomatic distress, carrying the unspoken illnesses of the people around them. And for the pure intuitive, the danger was disintegration, collapsing under the flood of unconscious material they could not structure or communicate. What united these patterns was the same psychological dilemma: extraordinary perception without integration leads to breakdown. Jung warned that three particular dangers made this discovery so threatening. First, disruption of the collective unconscious, because anyone who sees through shared illusions destabilizes the glue holding society together. Second, psychological isolation, for the curse of heightened awareness is living on an island of consciousness in an ocean of unconsciousness. And third, the dissolution of identity, where the boundaries between self and others dissolve until the individual no longer knows who they are. Jung feared this most of all, calling it not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation. Faced with these risks, Jung developed what he called the process of individuation. For those burdened with superior perception, individuation was not optional. It was a psychological necessity. Without it, the individual risked collapse under the weight of perceptions that outstripped their capacity to manage them. With it, the same perceptions could be transformed from a curse into a gift. The first phase was recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his patients to identify when they were absorbing material that did not belong to them. He called this conscious discrimination the ability to separate one's authentic inner experience from the emotions and unconscious content taken in from others. Without this step, no development was possible. To support it, Jung often instructed his patients to spend time in solitude, creating space to hear their own psychological voice apart from the noise of the collective. The second phase was shadow integration. Jung noticed that individuals who saw the shadows of others with piercing clarity often did so because they had not reconciled with their own. The more a person denied their own potential for selfishness, cruelty, or deception, the more unbearable it became to witness those qualities in others. Integration of the shadow, therefore, meant acknowledging that every human quality one observes exists also within oneself. This did not make a person bad, but whole. Only in this wholeness could perception remain clear without judgment and without overwhelming the perceiver. The third and final phase was what Jung described as conscious participation in the collective unconscious. Here, the task was not to retreat from the world, but to engage with it in a new way. The individuated person could interact with unconscious material from others without being consumed by it. They became what Jung called a psychological container, able to hold and witness the unconscious of others temporarily, while never losing sight of the fact that it did not belong to them. This ability turned what was once a destructive vulnerability into a stabilizing force for groups and relationships. Historical examples fascinated Jung. He contrasted Friedrich Nietzsche with Meister Eckhart to illustrate the difference between failed and successful integration. Nietzsche, Jung argued, possessed extraordinary vision but never learned to integrate it. Instead of channeling his perception into constructive wisdom, he wielded it like a weapon against society. His isolation deepened, and eventually he succumbed to psychological collapse. Meister Eckhart, by contrast, represented integration at its highest form. He possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, yet he expressed it in ways that nurtured others rather than alienated them. His humility prevented inflation, and his compassion prevented isolation. For Jung, Eckhart was a model of what happens when superior perception is successfully woven into an authentic and balanced life. Jung's own journey mirrored these struggles. Between 1913 and 1919, during his confrontation with the unconscious, he nearly collapsed under the weight of his own overwhelming perceptions. What saved him was his clinical work, which provided a structure to integrate what otherwise might have shattered him. His survival demonstrated that the difference between destruction and transformation lies not in the perception itself, but in the capacity to integrate it consciously. Jung understood that individuation was not a single achievement but a lifelong process. Even those who succeeded in integrating their superior perception could falter under stress trauma or sudden life transitions. He warned of 4 specific traps that frequently derailed the process. The first was inflation. When individuals identified too strongly with their extraordinary perception, they risked believing themselves prophets or saviors. Jung described this as psychological inflation, the ego swelling with archetypal energy. The danger, he noted, was that the person began preaching and judging rather than quietly embodying wisdom. Instead of being healers, they became isolated figures, convinced of their own superiority. The second trap was justified withdrawal. Some individuals, overwhelmed by their perception, retreated from society altogether, convincing themselves that others were too unconscious to deserve their attention. Jung called this a form of disguised spiritual superiority. True individuation, he argued, does not mean abandoning the collective, but engaging with it consciously. The hermit who flees the world is not transcending it, but being defeated by it. The third trap was what Jung termed the helper's identity. Certain perceptive individuals became addicted to being needed. Their self-worth was entirely tied to their ability to diagnose comfort or guide others. In the process, they abandoned their own development, dissolving their personality into the role of rescuer. Jung saw this not as individuation, but its opposite: the sacrifice of authentic individuality in service of a function. The fourth trap was regression into overwhelm. Even after achieving integration, individuals could regress, losing their boundaries, and again being flooded by the unconscious material of others. Jung stressed that integration required constant vigilance. The dance with superior perception was never static. It demanded regular solitude, deliberate choices about when to use one's abilities, continued shadow work to avoid projection, and creative outlets to release the pressure of accumulated perception. Beyond these traps, Jung emphasized the importance of finding allies. He wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, but this cannot be done in isolation. He identified 3 categories of relationships crucial for highly perceptive individuals. First, other individuated people. These rare encounters provided immediate recognition and authenticity that could not be faked. Jung called such connections the conscious minority, essential for psychological survival. Second, those in the process of individuation. People engaged in therapy, self-reflection, or spiritual practice might not share the same gift, but could appreciate it without defensiveness. Third, natural containers. These were mature individuals who, though not extraordinarily perceptive themselves, could hold the weight of another's perception without collapsing. In silence, they provided grounding and stability in a world that often resisted truth. For Jung, the challenge was to use superior perception wisely, not to brandish it as a weapon, not to bury it out of fear, but to transform it into cultural medicine. He described the individuated person as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, someone who makes the invisible visible without demanding that others accept it immediately. Their task is not to save the world, but to serve its gradual evolution. Jung's ultimate insight was that superior perception is not a flaw, but an evolutionary feature of consciousness. Those who see what others miss are not broken, they are ahead of their time. Yet this advantage carries a price: Without integration, it isolates, overwhelms, and even annihilates identity. With integration, however, it transforms into a vital contribution to the collective. Jung described these individuals as pioneers of consciousness, explorers of psychological territory that society will one day be forced to enter. He outlined 4 stages of this transformation. First, recognition without collapse, the moment you accept that your perception is real and significant, not an illusion or weakness. Second, integration without isolation, learning to embody your gift while maintaining relationships that ground you. Third, service without sacrifice, offering your insight as wisdom, not as judgment or burden. And fourth, legacy without attachment, sharing your contribution without clinging to whether others recognize or reward it. In this way, perception ceases to be a private torment and becomes a cultural medicine. Jung's message remains urgent today. In an era of social upheaval, environmental instability, and rapid technological change, highly perceptive individuals may be sensing truths that the collective refuses to acknowledge. Their symptoms of anxiety, alienation, or exhaustion may mirror exactly what society itself is struggling to face. The challenge is not to suppress these perceptions, but to integrate them so they serve transformation rather than destruction. The danger is not that you see too much. The danger is failing to use what you see wisely. Jung's warning was clear. If you learn to integrate your gift, you become not a victim of perception, but a bearer of culture, someone who helps humanity take its next step forward. The choice is yours. Will your perception destroy you, or will it redefine you?